Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Luke Thomas, and this is the Promotional Malpractice Live Chat here on MMAfighting.com. I'm the host of this podcast. You might know me from this podcast and others on the site. I really appreciate you guys joining me today, which is, by the way, Wednesday, the 22nd, 2017. Today on the podcast, we'll talk about GSP's return to the UFC, which is official, but we don't know which direction he's going to go. So we'll talk about the various possibilities there. We'll also get to some of the results over the weekend. UFC Fight Night 105, UFC Halifax, UFC Lewis versus Browne. Or they got to figure that nomenclature out, by the way. We need just one nomenclature for that, or one kind of nomenclature. But there's also Bellator 172, which turned out to be a bit of a dud, unfortunately, given what happened with Fedor and Mitrione. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about Bellator. And there's just a number of other news and notes floating out there. There's some Cyborg news out there if you want to get to that as well. So best place to do that, of course, is going to be in the comment section where this video is posted on MMA Fighting. Today's drink of choice, I have these, the core ones. They have, let's see, 5 calories a serving, containers per serving. Excuse me, servings per container. What am I saying? About 2, so about 10 or so calories, which is not dreadful. And I have a terrible sweet tooth, although there is evidence to suggest that certain kinds of artificial sweeteners actually make your sweet tooth worse. But this is the place we're in, so bear with me. Okay. Yummy. First question, which apparently is what I'm looking at here, causing some consternation for reasons that remain unclear. Okay, Luke. Over the past couple of years, the UFC has been letting go of many valuable commodities with the knowledge that they're likely to end up in Bellator. Several high-profile UFC fighters have already signed to the company, and top prospects like Joe Duffy and Misha Cirkunov are also likely to go there at some point. I don't know if likely is the word. Certainly possible is a very reasonable way to describe that. Likely, I don't know. On top of that, Bellator is currently in the process of attaining Mike Goldberg as their new color commentator. It's strange to me that the UFC went to great lengths to prevent Gilbert Melendez from going to Bellator a few years ago, but now they're increasingly letting go of notable fighters and employees. I find it very possible that in the future, Bellator could become a more formidable adversary to the UFC if they keep absorbing all of their assets. Your thoughts? I've been doing a lot of thinking about this too. I don't know how I feel about that, only to say we're just in a very new scenario. It's different than the old scenario where Bellator versus Strikeforce happened, where there was a clear number 1 and a distant number 2, but a very, or I should say, reasonably powerful number 2. I don't think we're quite there yet. Bellator, on occasion, can reach good heights. They can do, I think, consistently with their tentpole events, over $1 million at the gate, up to the $12,000 to $15,000, 12 to 15,000 person in attendance. And, $1.5 million and up, depending on who else is on the card. That is not anything to sneeze at, but it's not necessarily imminent doom for the UFC. What the UFC, I think, is letting happen is, they might not be reducing the number of shows, but it does appear like their global brand ambition has certainly been scaled back to some extent. Remember when they had that one picture that leaked where the picture of the Earth was in the shape of an octagon, and they were like world effing domination? I think they're scaling back on that some. I don't think totally, but certainly some, right? Because it's not merely that, they can go and, I had a long talk with Marshall Zelaznik, and one of the points he made was one of the benefits of going to Brazil, I think this is over 2014 generally, but maybe before that, was that in going to those venues and in trying to take advantage of that market at the time, it was very, very hot. You'll recall they did, I think, about 7 shows there that year. It helped them develop the infrastructure to put on shows at these venues that maybe didn't necessarily on their own come equipped with the kinds of things they needed to stream shows, let's say, on Fight Pass. And in so doing, that then opened up the door in their mind at the time to go to places that had similar constraints, right? South Korea might be a super advanced market, but apparently some of the venues that they were eyeing weren't, before those Brazil adventures, up to the task of being able to hold events there. And that now is no longer the case. At least the same restrictions don't necessarily apply, even if that market was ripe in other ways. But here's the point about that. In the same way in which they're now able to go globally, they now don't need to go globally as much, depending on what their priorities are. You'll recall now that, yes, they're going to places like Chicago and Denver, Nashville, right? These sort of larger American hubs, but they're also able to go to places like Hidalgo and a number of other, these are important regions in mixed martial arts in terms of where the fans are and how the fans might respond, but these aren't necessary. And that might actually I think the one venue there is a pretty nice venue. So it's not the same exact restrictions that were in play in Brazil. But the point being is they've managed to identify the fan base geographically. They've managed to clear some they've managed to clear some infrastructure hurdles with how they broadcast their product, which is to say, as they've opened up doors globally, they've also opened up doors internally, which allows them to rotate their product inside the North American space a little more easily as well. And I think to answer your question, this is sort of meandering here a little bit. When they had those global ambitions, they also, I think concurrently that went with that, was trying to lock up the roster of available talent to the best they could. But now that they're scaling back on that, now that they're able to really vary their show inside the North American space a little bit more nimbly, I think they're just going to be letting go of contracts of guys that they don't feel are either geographically relevant to them, are expensive relative to their, what they offer from a Q rating, right? Or, would they hold on to Gilbert Melendez now? And now I realize he's lost several fights. But I mean, if he was in that exact same scenario now, would they hold on to him? Probably not. I just think at the time, the sort of Fertitta era, they had this literal global ambition for the brand itself and for what kind of roster they needed to accomplish those goals. The current owners have a very different perspective. They, to me, feel much more like event promoters, where yes, they have to, take care of a roster, and yes, they have to make sure that, the sport is run on some kind of functional basis, but more to the point, they're looking for maximization of existing resources, and to the extent that somebody requires a significant degree of investment, or that it requires a degree of investment that seems unclear to pay off, right? Nikita Krylov, where is that really ultimately going to go? If you want to be sort of brutal about the analysis, now he may end up wanting to be the best light heavyweight in the world at some point, but I think they're thinking to themselves, probably the juice isn't worth the squeeze here. And because they don't care so much about making sure they have all the best fighters, some of these guys are going to slip through. Kyoji Horiguchi is another one where, I think the UFC tried to re-sign him, but, I think some of these guys are realizing, what does it really mean to be a UFC flyweight? You got a title shot against Demetrius Johnson. He got totally outclassed. Fighting in Ryzen allows him to get paid probably good to great dollars, to raise his profile in Japan, to compete against talent that's going to be good, but where he'll have an advantage to look good. So I think it's going to be good for local promoters on the one hand, and so let's say regional power players like Bellator as well. I don't know that it's going to be earth-shattering that they're going to let all these guys go, but it's also not clear to me that all these sort of like shows like One and Ryzen and Bellator I'd put ahead of them, but nevertheless are really up to the task of Bellator is, but some of the other ones are up to the task of like maximizing what could be coming their way. It's a complicated question with a sort of very complicated answer, and I kind of meandered a bit here, which I apologize for. All I'm sort of pointing out to you is, your question is, I find it very possible in the future Bellator could become a more formidable adversary to the UFC. They keep absorbing all their assets. They're going to absorb assets up to a point. I think at some point the UFC is not going to really let go of the core product of who is popular, who they really believe they can make popular. And so Bellator is going to make strides, have no doubt about it. But this is not the same as Strikeforce that came up at a time where they were able to consolidate talent early and then hold on to it. This is a very different position where there was a huge gap between who had the most talent and how much of the big product, how much they want to let go of what they have. That's a very different kind of scenario versus consolidating early and holding on in this new scenario. But, we'll see what kind of inroads they can make, both signing free agents and building from the ground up. All right. And people are mad at him for asking that question. I don't know why. Sympathy for Mitrione. Luke, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much sympathy do you have for Matt Mitrione after an illness caused him to miss out on the biggest fight of his career? Also, how idiotic are the dogs hitting on Fedor for not accepting another fight on just a few hours' notice? Yeah, I mean, look, I can understand. Look, I think here's why people are upset. MMA fans are used to the idea of fights falling through. They're used to, like, you know, you could see Grabaka Hitman Kaposo on Twitter being like, Tony Ferguson versus Khabib Nurmagomedov is not real until they're in the cage. And I completely, who could be mad at MMA fans for being scarred at this point? But you know, with that scarring also comes just a basic realization, like, fights fall through. You know, they get that. I think what the fans in San Jose were upset about was that they had an hour to basically make a call about whether they want to return their tickets or not. And if they're already en route, maybe you don't even know about it. Maybe you're not on Twitter, like, you know, you or I are on Twitter. And so they get to the venue, they find out the ticket window has closed for any kind of refund, and now Bellator or Fedor's not fighting. You know, they have a right to be upset. I mean, it's just not a great scenario. The question is, you know, did Bellator push it too late? I mean, what do you want Bellator to do? You know, do you want them to see if they can push it, to see if they can pull out a main event and make it happen? Do you want them to call it early and then, you know, Matt Mitrione says he could have fought and then everyone's bitter about it? Like, there's no real easy answer. It does seem to me if Mitrione is going to the hospital fairly early in that day, you know, erring on the side of caution is there worth taking seriously, but it's just a hard thing to do. You know, Matt Mitrione, I think, was probably giving him assurances that he could do it, and it's they wanted to make it happen. They wanted to make the fight go forward, and I don't know. It's just a really terrible situation where here's the thing. Like, if they knew he had kidney stones early or that he was dealing with some measure of discomfort, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know exactly what really could have been done. It's very easy to criticize on the outside, being like, oh, you didn't want to tell folks until the last minute because you didn't want them to have refunds. I can understand the skepticism about that, but at the same time, I think what the priority was to get a fight to happen. And here's the only thing, like, if they felt like this was here going forward, if one of your headliners is complaining about medical discomfort, I think days in advance now, what you should be doing is talking to other heavyweights or, you know, whoever the relevant other players in that weight class are, being like, look, probably a super remote chance, but if it happens, are you down to fill in? And so that way you can start negotiating ahead of time about some alternatives, right? It's one thing to say, you have a heavyweight fight, let's put a couple other heavyweight fights on the card. It's quite another to say, in advance, if something happens, are you ready to make this move? You know, and I don't know how that itself comes with its own complications, because what if one of the other guys finds out you're asking his opponent to jump up and not him? And there's no real easy answer here, but at least taking some precautions where, you know, at the last minute being like, hey, Fedor, do you want to fight Czech Congo? No, I don't. Didn't plan for that at all. And I'm not mad at Fedor. Fedor is like, you know, he probably shouldn't be fighting at this point. And even if he should be, he's doing the right thing by not taking that fight. Matt Mitrione is a very different fight than Czech Congo. You saw that on Saturday night, how Czech Congo basically fights at this point. I can completely understand why he didn't take it. I can also understand why fans will be disappointed. I'm really not super upset about it. I think the only question is here is, and we lack a certain amount of information to properly assess it, is just how early did Bellator really know that this was not going to happen? And it looks like they didn't really know until it was basically too late. But next time, if you've got, this is the point about having, I wrote an article about it. It was related to fight fiction, but one of the key points inside the article was their skepticism about what happens in fights where older athletes are competing. And one of my theories about this, I don't know this to be true, but one of my theories is that one of the reasons why we're confused about how fights look when older guys compete is because they have non-standard complexions. Like, older guys can't do the same things you take for granted that young guys do, old guys can't. So the bottom drops out in weird ways, and they don't fight. One of my sort of key points is they don't fight with the same kind of perseverance that a kid who's 23 years old. I mean, that kid who's 23 will fight ferociously. Guys who are 40, they don't fight with the same kind of intensity. They don't have the same kind of intensity really anymore. So, and so the same kind of thing, like, you just don't, when you have these old guys competing, you just don't know, I think from a health standpoint, when the bottom is going to drop out. they're going to be much more reluctant to just take on all comers at that point. Like my point is there's just a battery of different considerations you have to take into account when you're dealing with older athletes. And maybe some of these problems are less prevalent at heavyweight generally, but here's an example where they're not. Like there's just a certain amount of baggage and costs, both financial and other, that you have to pay when you're dealing with older athletes. And older athletes certainly aren't the only guys who pull out of fights late, but it also, I mean, kidney stones, like this is not something that typically has a huge impact on young men in their 20s, much more as you get older. But be that as it may. All right. I guess I can answer this one. Front Row Brian, Luke, what's with all the hate directed towards you by Front Row Brian? He went on quite a tirade on Twitter, calling MMA fighting fake news and calling you a puke. You handled it pretty well. What's the beef with you and him? I have no earthly idea. Mike Goldberg also took a shot at you. He must have too much time on his hands now. I mean, his jab literally didn't even make sense, so I can't even get into that. And really, I don't even want to get into this one. I mean, what do you guys want me to say? You want me to turn this into like, a stand-up comedy show or some kind of like yo mama insult con? Getting into a Twitter war, for the most part, is just a sad and pathetic thing to do. And I got into it a little bit. I'm partly guilty, but I basically just moved on. Even when I don't know what the problem is, talk to him, because I don't even have a problem. I got work to do. I've got deadlines, and really, like a Twitter war, man, it's like trying to goad someone into like a masturbation contest on a public elevator with strangers. Like there's not really a winner, and it's not really a dignified exercise with much of a point ultimately. I got better things to do. I'm too old for this. I've got a radio show 5 days a week. I've got 3 podcasts or 2 podcasts on the MMA beat. I've got deadlines for writing work I got to do. Like I got stuff to do, So if they want to rage out, man, that is perfectly up to them. But I'm not really interested in jacking off in front of strangers. So there you go. Okay, the state of the UFC light heavyweight division. Hi, Luke. Around 8 to 10 years ago, the light heavyweight division was the elite division of the UFC. It had the most fan interest. It was the marquee division. The most popular fighters and arguably the most exciting fights. The division featured a who's who of MMA. It had Liddell, Couture, Ortiz, Shogun, Vanderlei, Rampage, Machida, Griffin, Evans, and Bisping for a time, and an exciting up-and-comer named John Jones. How have we gone from this to the barren wasteland the division is today? It is bad when Bader and Krylov are going to be sorely missed that you have a number 5 ranked guy in Jimmy Manawa who has only beaten one top 10 talent. I don't really know what it is to say except I just think some of these things are cyclical. I don't know that there's any real identifying factor we can point to in terms of recruitment that we aren't getting guys who would naturally fit within that weight class in a way that we maybe didn't used to, or maybe in a way that we did used to. So that doesn't feel right to me. Some of these guys today, like a Krylov or a Bader, would beat the brakes off the very best versions of some of the guys we've seen before. So it's not like the talent. Jones, running through it has made it a little bit less interesting as well. There are times when guys sort of dominate a space that it kind of suppresses it, and when that goes away, it flourishes again. I think that's probably a contributing factor as well. But I guess my only point is it's hard to pinpoint anything in how these guys find their way to the light heavyweight division and how we promote them through the light heavyweight division that tells us something is amiss in that part of the process. To me, it just feels more cyclical. We do know that the older athletes in the heavier weight classes tend to hang around a little bit longer. So I think there's partly some of that going on. But I don't know that there's anything in the sport that we can say, here is a cause of this. How do we combat it? I think it's more just sort of like waiting around for the next bus to come. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it wasn't even the case that UFC had a great division. There was a time, of course, when UFC and Pride both had great light heavyweight divisions. It was a truly standout division. Now, some of those guys probably could have gone to middleweight, and some of them did. Bisping, you mentioned, Vanderlei, of course. Dan Henderson went back and forth. But I don't I don't necessarily feel like there's some hindrance. Well, we're always going to be at the mercy of what guys that size who are really talented might get pulled away from other things and go into stick and ball sports or something else. But I also believe that like this is not the end affirmatively of the light heavyweight division. It will have some brighter moments. It may take John Jones leaving. It may take several years to rebound, but I suspect over time it will. I do believe it will replenish itself. Maybe that one heyday was simply just this sort of like golden moment, this bizarre era where we had so many guys who could compete that way. Perhaps there was a bit of serendipity there. Maybe that's the case. I don't know. But suffice to say, I am not convinced we are stuck with this sort of morass forever. I do think it will ultimately, at least in some way, rectify itself. But it is, people forget, like the toughest divisions are clearly the lighter weight ones. You can make an argument about which ones you think are the toughest, bantamweight or lightweight or welterweight. I would go with lightweight, but, opinions vary. But man, 205 was for a long time the division, right? It was the home of the stars. It was the home of the best fights. It was something else, and that has certainly been eclipsed. I think also the growth of the other divisions has made it look bad. Like there was no bantamweight division before, right? Back in the era you're talking about. For a time, there wasn't even a lightweight division. So, there was a welterweight one, and that was pretty good. But part of this is that those guys were bigger than live stars, yes. But it's also a bit of, now that we have more competition, they also don't look quite as good, All right, true, false. If GSP comes back and wins another UFC title, he'll cement himself as the greatest mixed martial artist of all time. Maybe. Taking that kind of time off, and let's assume he wins a title shot on his way back, either against McGregor or Bisping. Going to be tough to argue against it. But all it would do was sort of like redouble. All it would do is bring to bear the same kind of conversation we've been having about McGregor. What's tougher to do, jump around and take big fights against very, very tough guys, or stand a post and let wave after contender come? And it will just depend on your perspective. But certainly, adding 2 titles in 2 different weight classes to his resume would make it, if not the best, right up there. Tony Ferguson's slick Granby rolls will help him escape from Khabib's ironclad body lock. To an extent, yeah. Here's basically what I think. Khabib's rides are incredible. I don't feel like a fresh Khabib versus a fresh Tony. I'm not going to say it's not competitive, because it very well could be. But I believe basically on balance, Khabib's probably going to get the better of that. He's great at risk control. He's good at distributing his weight. He's got all forms of scrambles himself. People don't realize he's a great top scrambler as well. So I generally think that will go to his favor. The question is, how much, one, does that take out of him? And two, at what point does that have an effect on the fight? So I guess my point is, like, a fresh Khabib should basically be able to control Tony, I think. But once that, Tony was fresh after 5 rounds at altitude. That's a guy with some serious cardio. Can Khabib really hang on for that? Eddie Alvarez, whatever you want to make of his performance against Conor McGregor, was very adamant. He's like, you can wrestle for 3 out of 5 rounds. After that, however you can wrestle for 15 minutes of a 25-minute fight. But other than that, you got to do some other things. And Tony can just go all the time. I think what Khabib needs to do is not merely control him, but when he's got him down and in a control position, he needs to do damage. He needs to do real damage. He needs to cut him open. He needs to rock him. He needs to box his ear. He needs to physically and metaphorically draw blood, because if you just bang on him a little bit and then 3rd, 4th round, he's still got his foot on the gas, that's trouble for Khabib, So to me, it's like, is Tony a great wrestler? No doubt about it. Does he have tremendous escapes? I'm not going to argue against it. I don't think they're probably good enough to hang with Khabib early. The question is, once Khabib begins to lose some steam, all bets are off. So will they help him? Yes. But the question is, enough to win? How early in the fight? It's strange that Anderson's infamous tie clinch isn't that effective anymore. No, people just avoid it for the most part. Guys are better at fighting in the clinch. Guys are better about fighting out of the clinch. Guys also are wary of his clinch. That doesn't, no. Travis Browne, a once promising prospect, is a good example of a talented fighter with a horrible career management. You know what, man? That's a tough one. From what Jesus, my live chat is like blowing up. Okay. Bad career management. That's a tough question to answer. And the reason why is that I do think it's like you left Alliance and you left Jackson Wink, and as I understand it, not necessarily on the best terms, and you went to Edmond, and that didn't work out for a while, but you still retained the services of great trainers like Ricky Lundell. I have a tremendous amount of respect for Ricky Lundell. We did a heel hook and leg lock technique talk together. It was one of my favorite ones. Very smart guy, very dedicated professional. I really did think that Travis looked good early in that first round. I really did believe that. And it just wasn't enough in the end for reasons we've already gone over 1,000 times. So, like, how much of that to the current predicament is bad career management? Certainly a big part of it. You know, leaving these elite teams for maybe personal reasons, but very dubious professional ones that carry, in fact, professional costs. You know, I understand his need to get more one-on-one attention, but you can bring in individual coaches for that. You don't have to leave a team necessarily for that. I just feel like this guy has walked a certain path where it just feels like a lot of the things in his personal life have narrowed the scope of what is available to him professionally. And not that he has had, you know, Ricky Lundell is an elite trainer, but just leaving the teams in the way that he did, these things seem driven largely by personal choices. And as long as that's the deciding factor, there's going to be a cost to pay. And I think you're seeing it. So your question is, with horrible career management, I don't know if management is this problem so much as, from the outside anyway, it's his own personal management, as I understand it. Because I do think he's athletic, and I do think he's talented, and I do think he fought well in that first round. And Edmond wasn't in his corner, and whatever he was doing in camp, he was doing the right things. Like, he had Derrick Lewis hurt. He was doing good. He was doing well anyway. But I just feel like he has made a number of private choices that bore fruit professionally, and now the harvest is here. Mario Yamasaki's stoppage of the Browne-Lewis fight was one of the worst late stoppages we've seen recently. It was really bad. It was so bad, in fact, that even Mario spoke to our own Guillermo Cruz here at MMA Fighting and even conceded as much. He sort of put it down to like maybe 2 or 3 punches. It was a little bit more than that, but nevertheless, he understood it to be a bad call. And you know what? I'm going to give Mario a lot of credit, and I'll tell you why. It's because these judges, when they make bad calls, or maybe even calls they regret later, you know, after the fact, we've talked about this before, where these judges' decisions, it's their rough draft, and they're turning it in. They might come back and be like, how did I make that call? You know, we don't know, because we never get a chance to talk to them. I will give Mario Yamasaki credit. Yes, he made a bad mistake, but I'll tell you what he did do. He went and he spoke to the media about it, and, you know, it's a little harder for him to see things the way we see things, but he acknowledged that he could have done a better job. And I appreciate that. This is a public official working for a state or a government entity, taking the responsibility to be transparent about his own wrongdoing and to talk to the media. These guys don't have to do that, and most of them don't. And I appreciate that he did. I really do. I think that means a lot. I think he learned from that. Guys make mistakes. This one, it's a pretty costly one, to be honest, but I will give him the credit insofar as being committed to public scrutiny because it's not easy, and they're not required to do it. And when they don't do it, we have no real way of knowing what they're learning from it. We at least now have some sense of after the fact reflection from Yamasaki, and that's really important. So I give him a ton of credit. Can this chat get 3 true or falses per question? I'll do 5 or less. You do more than 5, I won't do them. Luke, is it funny or sad that the conservative right only decided to drop Milo? I'm not even getting it. I'm not getting into Milo. Everyone and their brother right now has Milo takes. Go read theirs. Todd Grisham, how would you grade Grisham's play-by-play for Sunday night's or Sunday's fight night card? This person says, quote, I thought he did rather well considering it's his first time calling a UFC show, and it feels like people are being way too hard on him, especially considering it was his first attempt on the job. Yeah, I think basically that's about right. Thought it started better than it ended. I think some of the stuff in that main event where he was like, Travis, get out of there. I was like, that's not what we want. That was bad. That wasn't very good. But in terms of being able to ease his way through the broadcast from the various different parts of the production elements to calling the action where he says enough but doesn't get in Brian Stan's way. Brian Stan, of course, always does a great job. I thought on those counts he was basically good. There was just a little bit, I think the problem was you want to let your personality shine in broadcasting. With the little I've done of it for, I've done a lot of broadcasting, but the little I've done on commentary, which is super difficult and I'm terrible at. It's a hard balance to strike. He'd never worked with Brian Stan before. They probably did some trial runs, but they never done one on air together. So that's tough. But the point being is you want to let your personality come to light. Like you want to give a broadcast your signature, but you don't want to give it in such a way where it's you don't want to scribble on the screen, right? Where it becomes distracting. And I think what wound up happening was, for the most part, he kept it in bounds. There were just some moments that sort of the Tanya Harding joke, which I appreciated personally. But when you take that as a larger body of work with that, he had a couple other ones too. And then that one of Travis Browne, Travis, get out of there. It was just like, okay, you need to dial that back a little bit. You need to slowly work in your personality, which is what John Anik has done. People accuse John Anik of being robotic early, and some still maintain this criticism. But to me, that was probably intentional. His thought was people aren't, when you start broadcasting, one of the things you may not realize this is people aren't ready for your personality usually. There are always going to be outliers to that where someone's personality is instantly magnetizing. There are going to be scenarios where someone's personality is instantly something you gravitate to. They might be very, very funny. They might be physically attractive, and they might have a gift of gab in some kind of way where you just respond to them. But in MMA, you have to remember, this is MMA is a group where the fans will routinely pick membership over competency. Right? Are you an insider or are you an outsider? That's the number one question, more so than are you good at this job or are you bad at this job? And that can be for anything, from fighter to promoter to broadcaster to all the way down. Like, are you one of us or are you not one of us? It's very much a question there. And I think Anik was very, very wary of that early. Like, when you first start talking to the world, people might be naturally skeptical because they don't know anything about you, and then two, that is a uniquely strong phenomenon in MMA. So maybe Grisham was very, very loose and trying to be jovial, and it backfired a little bit, and that's okay. Nothing wrong with that. It was his first time. So let's see how he does going forward. Does he dial back the personality and then slowly weave something a little bit more palatable, I'd even argue a little bit more responsible back in? Saying, talking about these fights like it's like you're reading a comic book, probably not the best idea. But I think the guy's very, very talented. He's done a lot of commentary before, including in the combat sports space. I always liked him on ESPN. I thought he was really good there. I'm glad to see him on the job. I thought, again, generally him and Brian Stan were pretty great. Just some editorializing and some personality infusion that probably needs to get, dialed back a little bit. Someone says, I thought he did worse than Goldie. He called half guard almost mount. and said the Black Beast was like 162 pounds. Even Stan had to correct him. I don't remember the almost amount part. It says Grisham is too green. Maybe so. Yeah, he's got some work to do. He's got some work to do. You can see that Anik is basically your runaway choice as the number one play-by-play guy. Okay, recent UFC releases. Best of days. First, I'm assuming that Barcelona's current blight warms your heart in the most touching of fashions. Well, it was, and when I started, what is the Valencia Real Madrid score? It was 2-0 when I started this freaking podcast. What is it now? 2-1. Okay, that's something. I guess Ronaldo scored. I'll take that at halftime. This isn't totally a disaster. So yes, to answer your question, yes, it warms my heart a little bit. What's the real question? What do you think about UFC releasing rising stars and top talent because of tough contract negotiations? Am I wrong in feeling that UFC is trying to set a tough example for the mid-card level fighters, but going after? I think this is really, it's more just a cost-cutting issue, not like, oh, you make a lot, we have to cut you. I think they're willing to pay a lot for the guys who can generate a lot. The question is, what is your Q rating, right? What is your general level of public popularity and visibility? And what do we expect it to be? What is it costing us? And to what extent does our investment in growing that make sense? And I think that's why they're making some more difficult choices. You know, if they put on a headlining contest, another promoter with Serkinov versus Krylov, you and I might like it, but that's not tearing up the ratings. And I think that would be their argument. Like, a lot of fans have always been like, do you remember the argument about like, okay, so you may not believe this because the tide has turned dramatically, but several years ago, a lot of UFC fans used to repeat the company line about fighter pay. You know, if you want to make more money, you know, go eat what you kill. Like, they would just repeat UFC talking points back to you. And there's less of that now. I think a lot of fans have changed positions where they're much more willing to repeat the idea that, like, you know, maybe I don't want to hear you cry about it, but I get it. Like, fighters should be paid more. They don't have collective bargaining. If they had collective bargaining, they would naturally get more, and so does the space. And so I think more fans are aligned that way. But it used to be the case that they would say, you know, nobody cares about the people on the prelim cards. Now, you could put Serkinov and Krylov anywhere, but that's the kind of fighter who might be a little bit more likely to end up there, right? Let's say for a pay-per-view, it's possible you could find them there. And the argument was always bankrupt, because the argument was always, well, they're putting them on Fox Sports 1, and Fox Sports 1 is selling ads against them. So they have some worth. It's not true that no one cares about them. They don't have as much as, you know, a headliner necessarily, but they have some. But you get the idea. They have significant value in bulk. And I think those guys who fit in the minds of the matchmakers and the owners, the guys who have that space where they fit into the mold of someone who has value as a function of the bulk with everyone else, those are going to be the guys who are going to be in the chopping block, it seems to me. You know, Kyoji Horiguchi, you and I might be like, Jesus, don't let the number 5 guy go, you know, or more than that, you know. But they're like, Kyoji Horiguchi who? Really going to miss him? Really going to tear up the ratings for, you know, over in Japan? I mean, he might for Japan or something, but he wouldn't for U.S. audiences, you know. So I think that's the way they're looking at it, and expect more big cuts that might surprise you. I don't think it's so much they don't want to shell out cash. They want to shell out cash with the hope of making a return on it. That's the difference. Black Beast Mania. Luke, Derrick Lewis is one of my favorite fighters and has been since I saw him back in 2012 when he annihilated Jared Rosholt. I remember that. Since coming to the UFC, he's gone 8-2, including 6 straight wins with 7 knockouts inside the octagon. The man isn't technical. He's a little more technical than you think, but he's fun to watch due to his kill or be killed mentality and refreshing, hilarious, brutally honest interviews. He also loves steak, which is awesome. Can't argue with that. How high is his ceiling, in your opinion? Has he reached it already? Maybe. He'll always have a puncher's chance against anyone, but would you give him anything more than a puncher's chance against anyone in the top 5 of the heavyweight division, assuming he doesn't switch to a more notable camp anytime soon? Also, How remarkable do you think he can be, since he is very fun and entertaining, but perhaps a little too real and obscure for some people's tastes? I think he's the people's champion, right? I mean, the guy is the king of social media. Everyone was getting bitter about that Black Snake Moan Photoshop he did. And I'm like, it's a joke, y'all. Lighten up. Who cares? God, who cares? There were some people that were just crying about it. Who gives an F? But anyway, I mean, look, man, I made this point on my post-fight show and on the Monday Morning Analyst too. You're right about Derrick Lewis. Like, I thought Ben Folks had a good way of describing it as well. It's like, you know, it feels like when you write down his skills, you could basically write them on the back of a napkin. But his record sort of shows you that there's a little bit more to the story, and I think there is more to the story. There's the other things that happen in a bout that you really have to recognize. People are wary of his power. Like when people fight John Lineker, they don't fight John Lineker the same way they fight other guys. You know, maybe John Dodson does because it's John Dodson, but a lot of guys are very, very wary of his power. TJ Dillashaw might have beaten John Lineker, but TJ Dillashaw had to work around it. Rob Font had to work around it. Michael McDonald tried to challenge it and paid for it. So I think partly people realize that he is gifted enough of a power and accuracy puncher that if they don't take it seriously, they're going to go to sleep very, very badly. And that's the case for everyone, but it's especially the case with him. So I think partly he's changing how guys approach a fight. You know, Travis Browne was fighting on the outside. You know, they want the Black Beast to change that. And that tells you something. Not that he's not fighting on the outside before, but he was really fighting on the outside. So I think that's one. And I think the other thing for me is, you know, he has good finishing instincts. Obviously, we know about his power. He's got a decent array of punches. Head hunts a little bit, but he can split guards. He can go over the top. He can put punches and combinations together. Doesn't do a whole lot of movement, but he's physically strong. Has surprising cardio. But I mentioned this before. He's a very surprisingly patient fighter. Like, he sticks to his strengths. He might have a decent armbar. You never know. I doubt it, but he might have a decent guillotine. He might have a decent kickboxing game, you know, more generally. But the truth of the matter is, like, he's been in bad spots in fights and found his way out. That is a skill. If you're listing the skills of Derrick Lewis, big power, blah, 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 all the things we mentioned, you have to add to that list perseverant. He can withstand pain. He can withstand flurries. He can force a guy to be patient with him, which allows him to just find more openings over time. And when he gets into trouble, he doesn't panic. He doesn't panic. He also has brutal ground, an excellent ground and pound. To me, you know, I think it says something about guys. You know, I made this point before. You know, when Fujita rocked Fedor, Rampage was on commentary, and Rampage was, when Fedor came back, Rampage was like, "That's what a champion does. A champion comes back." And it's true, man. Like, I'm not comparing Fedor to the Black Beast, but I guess what I am saying is, I mean, being perseverant is a real thing. It's a real thing, and I believe that it'd be one thing if he was a power puncher and a front runner. He's not. He comes back from bad spots in ways you don't expect, and all he needs is a small moment to affect change, and boom, the whole thing collapses for his opponents around him. It's pretty remarkable. All right, Eat My Shorts writes 1,000 questions. We're not going to get to all of them. Steven, no, I'm going to skip that one too. We're going to skip the first two from Eat My Shorts because they're all the same. Hey, so-and-so's fighting so-and-so. Who do you like? And I appreciate you putting in questions, but you got to limit these a little bit. Megan Anderson's comments on facing Cyborg. A week or two ago, Megan Anderson gave an interview to ESPN where she expressed that she did not want to fight Cyborg yet for two reasons. First, she knew she needed to hone her craft over one or two fights before facing someone like Cyborg. Second, she knew that it would be a big payday match and did not feel that her current profile was enough to really reap the financial benefits from the bout. What did you think of Megan Anderson's reasoning in the interview, which you hopefully had read before the question? I had not, but I'll take your word for it. And do you think it is smart for fighters to be so direct about their thought process when discussing why they don't want to fight other top-level fighters, as it seems the ducking accusation is thrown around quite lightly at times? Well, you're right about that. I think Megan Anderson and her management are absolutely correct. We have talked about it before. If you are a Fight Pass customer, go and watch her fights. She is a little green. I don't know how else to say it. It doesn't mean she's not talented. Doesn't mean she won't be a champion one day. Doesn't mean there aren't a bunch of things she does already really well. All those things are true. She is, I'm sorry to say, a little green. Her defense needs a lot of work. Even in fights where she wins, she gets tagged badly. And that is something to be worked on. That is a kryptonite aspect for any potential fight with Cyborg. It'd be a very bad idea. Very bad. So to me, they have the right response to say, look, if they're going to make this fight, we want to be at a point where we can, maximize the financial returns. And two, maybe we're just not ready to fight her yet. They're not. And there's nothing wrong with saying that. There's nothing wrong with saying that. She's being pushed that direction because there's no other women really to consider in that division. So it's like understandable that I think fans and other media observers would be like, well, Megan Anderson's here. I get that. No problem. But she's just asking, like, is she ready for this level of talent? No. And you might be like, well, are Holly and Jermaine? No, but Holly and Jermaine have worked out the full depth of their game. Like, if you have a chance to work out the full depth of your game and you're still not ready, well, then you're just not ready. But I feel like Megan Anderson's getting better every single fight, man. I feel like she's becoming a better striker. I do feel like her defense is getting better. I feel like her ground scrambling is getting better. I feel like her takedown defense is getting better, like in a way where you can see this is still a developmental process. So I get it, man. Everyone wants to see, a fight that Megan Anderson, when she's moving forward, she's tearing people to pieces. But there's some work to be done. There's some work to be done for sure. And I think credit should go to her management and her for having the maturity to recognize that they still want to be in the lab a little bit. I really respect that. I talked to Paul Felder yesterday, and he made an interesting point because I asked him about going to Duke Roufus. And what he said was, I was like, that was, you're not ranked in the top 15. It's a very tough division. What do you want to do next? That was a sick win over Alessandro Ricci. And his answer was, I just want to fight anyone. And he made this was a great point. He was like, I know that the UFC likes it when you call out somebody, but I just changed camps. And one of the benefits he sort of noted about working, he had nothing but positive to say about the East Coast super friends, Ricardo Almeida and all those guys, Eddie Alvarez and everybody, and Frankie Edgar and Edson Barboza. He had nothing but good things to say about him. But I guess he feels like he gets a little bit more individual attention at Duke's. And more than that, like, Paul Felder's got his own style, but you saw that up elbow. That's straight from Thai boxing. And, man, Duke Roufus is a really talented striking coach and has a great background in Thai boxing. And so the point being was, he was like, look at what I was able to do after just one camp, the way he was able to make Paul Felder's always really good about stepping on the gas with his offense, but it's a little bit of a harder trick for him to continue to step on the gas and then make great offensive choices. And he usually makes good offensive choices. I thought he was making great ones here, really good ones here, especially as Alessandro was, changing stances. And then he threw the up elbow because he said, and I was right about this, that Ricci was stepping in really hard with that jab, so he wanted to meet him with it. He was doing like a boxing jab, not an MMA jab, which is a little bit more. It's less tethered in some ways. Point being was, he goes, I'm still working out my game. I want to fight a ranked guy when this process is over. I'm still figuring things out a little bit. Now Paul's a little bit more advanced in his age and his career, but it's the same kind of idea. Like, let me fight those people when this process is basically over. And some might call that ducking, and some might be like, well, when's the process over? It's an inexact science. I grant you. It's very frustrating to hear somebody say that. I grant you. But I think someone like Megan is probably owed that. You're just going to throw it to Cyborg next. That feels. And yeah, I know these people get out there and they say all kinds of things like, I want to fight so-and-so. I want to fight so-and-so. I get all that. And it gets the fans riled up too. And the media riled up. But I get it, man. I completely side with her on this one. Interesting question. The check is in the mail. All right. At the beginning, Zuffa took on huge losses to keep the sport alive. Then the sport wasn't big enough for fighters to make big money. Investing in a global strategy will be better for the fighters in the future. Quote, we give them health insurance, a new fitness center, and the best anti-doping program. I like how anti-doping is part of like health and wellness. That's a total joke, but okay. Who else does that? Now, after the sale to WME IMG, a large portion of revenues generated by the sport will go to wealthy investors that finance the purchase of the organization. After 15 years of making ever-changing claims of why Zuffa is entitled to a large majority of profits, will the structure of the deal to sell UFC to WME IMG end up being the most detrimental to the sport and exploitative to the fighters? You know, it's interesting that we brought this up. I have Mike Bisping on my radio show today. I'm very curious to talk to him because, look, I've made this point very, very clear. I've got nothing against St-Pierre looking for big money fights. I mean, the guy's done everything that's ever been asked of him by this company and was, I would think, at one point not necessarily treated all that great. Him asking for a big-ass payday, I can get that, man. I can totally understand it. Same with Michael Bisping, man. He doesn't have much time left, and he's been quite honest about that, you know? And here's a guy who's not even a middleweight who could generate massive bucks for him, and he could get the biggest payday of his career right at the end of it. Like this is his one window to finally make money. Like, I'm not mad at him for trying to get some money. Like, he should do that, you know? I get it. But that doesn't mean that we have to do that. That doesn't mean that you have to do that or I have to do that. And but here's the issue. If you make arguments against the GSP, and I actually wrote them down. Let me pull them up for you. I've made a few arguments. Let me just run through these because it answers your question pretty nicely, I think. I hope. Okay. Like, why? There's lots of reasons why you might want to make a GSP versus Bisping match. Two of the reasons I just stated. It's good for both guys, both good guys in the sport. That's a great reason. Two, I don't think you can guarantee this, but it might be just a great fight. Like, it could be really compelling action. I also think there's an equal chance it could be quite a dud. And it could be, in the end, it could also be something like Canelo versus Khan, where it's like, oh, yeah, that's why we didn't do that fight, because one guy was never really a part of this weight class, and the size disparity was too much, and that didn't make a lot of sense in the end. You could get that as well, but you could also envision a scenario where the fight was compelling, right? And you could say it'll do, you know, just gangbusters. People really want to see it. They want to see two stars clash. It meets some kind of market demand. Those are like really concrete ideas that have short-term, immediate, impactful relevancy on your life as a fan. To the point where if they announce it, you might even consider, gee, do I want to buy tickets for that? You know, you see what I'm saying? Like, this really impacts your life as a fan. If you're a fan of MMA, that has a direct impact on your life, and perhaps a big one. Right? Think about the arguments against the fight. Here's just a few of them. Number one, if you go and look back at articles around 2006 and 2007, I've been researching this. One of the core bedrock principles that you see people say about why UFC is growing and why it might be better than boxing. I'm not here to say it's better than boxing. I'm here to say that's what they were saying. It's like, hey, man, the best fight the best. Like, champions can't duck contenders anymore. You know what? And you get turnover from it, and guys have losses on their record, but there's such an integrity to the process. This fight undermines that. It undermines the core bedrock of what people were saying in the first generation of post-Ultimate Fighter fans about what really appealed to them in that product. I think undermining that's a bad idea. You could say it undermines the notion of championship priority. Why should I care about your belt when you don't? If you don't want to defend your belt, okay, I get it, but you should relinquish it. If you're telling people it's okay to not defend your belt and do other things, why would a fan ever get the idea that it's something to be taken seriously? And forget Bisping and GSP and everybody else. How about the idea of WME creating weight classes where there's no real contenders like women's featherweight, or just adding 1,000 interim belts? Right? All these things contribute to that notion generally. It's not merely these two participants, but if you make that fight, you are doubling down on that. It erodes consumer faith in the brand. If the faith in the brand is based on some idea of they make the fights that are supposed to happen and now they don't, you begin to erode some of that. Let me finish some of these. By the way, Bisping also has a super compelling contender. It's not like you want to make Bisping versus GSP because he doesn't want to have anyone for him at middleweight. No, there's a row of killers waiting for him. GSP, by the way, has other lucrative options. He could go the McGregor route and fulfill a lot of the same responsibilities. That fight has its own consequences and costs, but you get the idea. It could create unnecessary divisional chaos. People are like, oh, well, WME has these needs. WME has those needs. Right, WME does. My job as a media member is not to worry about WME's needs. It is to speak to different priorities that the sport might have. So I can't be burdened in thinking about things as though I'm an executive in one of those meetings. I have a very different vision and responsibility, frankly, to talk about the sport. There's no guarantee the fight will be good. What value is there in being a number one contender if it doesn't really get you anything in the end? How might that change fighters' priorities over time if they realize that they don't really necessarily need to go that far, if they can just rattle a saber and be somewhere in the middle to the back of the line and still get a title shot? What is the real value in taking the tough fights to move along there? And then ultimately, it's not even about this decision. What does this decision give birth to? What are we doing fundamentally with the slippery slope here about getting away from the perfect adherence to the architecture to now where we're not even awarding title fights to a very deserving contender who is ready to rock, where we're messing now with a divisional calendar, we're creating chaos, right? What other things will happen as a consequence of this? This in itself might have some consequences. What do they give birth to down the road? How far is this going to erode everything? But here's the core nature of those arguments. It's all about what happens in the future down the line, to an extent, unpredictably. This is the problem with what happens when people propose these super fights. They never consider some of the long-term ramifications that are hard to, in some ways, know, in some ways hard to identify, because you can identify there's going to be tickets on sale and a live gate and da-da-da. We could put it on the calendar if we make the super fight. These immediate bursts of short-term validation that ultimately undercut the bedrock of what makes the product and what it has been. And so it's just less compelling as an argument, even though all these arguments against GSP versus Bisping might be right, they're somehow less compelling because I'm asking you to consider the potential consequences, what it might give birth to. And I don't think fans and media observers and really the community generally takes those arguments as seriously as they should. I think ultimately what they decide is, hey, look, if it's going to make money, it's going to make Mike rich, it's going to make GSP rich, people can wait. But when you start abandoning, not merely in degree, but almost kind, the best practices of divisional and sport maintenance, you create some problems in the immediate and especially in the long term. And I kind of feel like that will get lost because I'm asking you just to imagine. So, to answer the question, will this WME IMG deal end up being the most detrimental to the sport and exploitative to the fighters? I don't know for any kind of certainty, but I do worry about matchmaking that only considers the immediate validation and ignores many of the long-term consequences. Thinning divisions and a smaller roster. Jesus, all the questions are about this. There's been a recent emergence of French articles citing UFC fighters' discontent with the new regime. Something that stuck out to me was Valerie Letourneau's comments on the new owners looking to cut back to wanted to eliminate 1/3 of their roster. So I went ahead and looked up the upcoming UFC schedule. Of the 6 events they have previewed on their site, only 1 men's flyweight bout has been scheduled and 1 women's fight per card. My question, do you think there's some truth to this? Yeah, we've been over this already. Holly's appeal. Hey, Luke, most people's reaction to the news that Holly will appeal her loss was to scoff at it, and I considered it futile, and initially I shared that view. However, the issue is actually much less subjective than most appeals. All of the judges had Holly losing by 1 point only, and I think this has been unanimous that Germaine Duran-Ami should have had at very least been deducted 1 point for her 2 illegal strikes. Therefore, it would be hard to dismiss Holly's appeal. Can you see a successful appeal? No, I cannot. Usually, the only way in which the judges will review it is under the criteria that there was literally an arithmetic error, right? Oh, I didn't carry the 1 or something, or that there is some sort of evidence of collusion, like literal malfeasance within the judges who scored the fight, like just trying to argue their scoring criteria or argue about something a referee didn't do that he didn't necessarily have to do. Good luck. They give extremely wide latitude to judgment, and they give very wide latitude to a referee. Like a referee didn't do something he didn't have to do. Now, maybe you think he and I should have, but he didn't. How are you going to challenge that? Good luck. You're going to need it. So who wins? Lewis versus Ngannou. I would give it to Ngannou, but I'd love to see it. Man, I would love to see it. GSP next fight. Dana White recently said that GSP can pretty much have any fight he wants from 155 to 185, assuming he can make 155. What do you make of George's chances against the top people in those three divisions? All right, against McGregor, I give him a very good chance. He'd be I don't know what he would look like exactly a lightweight, but presumably he would be a big one. I think he would have relative amount of ease getting McGregor to the floor and then holding him there. Potentially even submitting him. Against Tyron Woodley, I don't think so. I think Woodley would have strong takedown defense and would crush him. And against Bisping, someone's asking why I think it's a sham fight. I have already explained. But yeah, I think his chances are good as you go up. Or sorry, bad as you go up. But you know what? St-Pierre is incredible, right? One of the best all time. Maybe him taking all this time off and shredding his other ACL in this time off is not nearly as disqualifying as some might presume it to be. Let's see. It's a question about Shaman Moraes. I have not followed the saga, but apparently it's quite sad. I'm sorry to not answer it. I don't know enough about it to have any kind of real comment. Does Derrick Lewis behind Conor have the best post-fight interviews? Connor's are almost like Shakespearean, where it's a guy taking a stage and speaking in a manner reflective of such. Derrick Lewis is just someone at the barbecue keeping it real. You know what I mean? They're very different kinds of, imagine going to a friend's barbecue, and Derrick Lewis is like that guy that just kind of keeps it real there. There's a certain amount of showmanship to what McGregor's doing that I don't think Lewis is trying to or even could do if you wanted to. But they almost arrive in similar positions because we're sort of shocked by what appears to be either candor or the appearance of candor. We're shocked by the statements for how unusual and out of the norm they are. But yeah, I mean, Derrick Lewis is a treasure. Conor is too, As well as his amazing troll game on Instagram and carrying around a toy belt, LOL, will it get him into trouble soon? I don't think it'll get him into trouble. If anything, it's working for him. Have you all seen King Mo on Instagram? Like, I'm not kidding. Every day, and I'm not exaggerating this, every day he posts a different Photoshop of an overweight African-American gentleman, some cases morbidly so, with Rampage's face pasted on top. He is committed to the bit. I will put it that way. It's kind of funny to watch. All right. Or O fans after Saturday? That's an interesting question. Do they have obligations to the fans who could not receive funds for this past Saturday's event? Announcing the Fedor fight cancellation mere hours before the actual event is to start. Anyone that had bought a ticket to the event needed to ask for a refund before the actual event began in order to receive a refund. Otherwise, they had to go to the event to get any use out of the ticket. Fedor versus Mitrione was the main attraction and one of the two fights on the card that was receiving any sort of promotion. Does Bellator owe it to their fans that were shafted this past Saturday? I understand the inevitable cards subject to change fine print, but if something similar had been pulled by the UFC, would they be receiving far more hate and would be a bigger story than what is currently for Bellator? It'd be a bigger story because the UFC is a bigger story and they have typically bigger fighters. So probably to some extent, I never really understand Bellator to UFC comparisons. They're not the same kind of organization. They don't do all the same things. They have a very different business model, and they're vastly, I mean, there's almost an infinite space between them in terms of, their level of dominance in the market. But be that as it may, I mean, look, you want them to give money back? I mean, I don't know what you want them to do. They're going to try and bring another show back to San Jose. I think if they do, they need to stack it. Maybe they could lower the price points on cards or the tickets as a goodwill gesture. They could do some kind of free events in town that week. they can just do something for the folks who, I mean, they can't go back individually and pay people who feel like they were shafted, although you think that they probably should. But I think what they can do is they can just, but they've been good to that San Jose market. I mean, let's be honest about that. But in keeping with that tradition, create a week full of free events and access to fighters and stack a card and make sure that in case something happens, you have contingency plans in place, as aforementioned. But beyond that, I don't really know what's realistic or, what do you expect a corporation to do? I get being upset, believe me, but it's just realistically, it seems out of reach beyond that. And I think they will. And Coker has already said, by the way, he's trying to go back to San Jose. So there's that too. All right. Have I heard anything about the Diaz brothers? Nope. I will let you know if I do, though. Al Iaquinta, what are your thoughts on Al and his contract situation? I guess real estate in Long Island isn't what it's cracked up to be. I mean, he comes back to the exact same one he left on, where he had a ton of problems with. It's got to be tough. It's got to be tough. Don't sign long contracts if you don't think there's going to be a chance of you fulfilling them. Don't put yourself in a position where you have no leverage. If at all, you can avoid it. Easier said than done. But basically, he was in a position where he had no leverage. He had no better options. He had no better opportunity. He had no way to affect change. And so he was the one who had to fold. It's a fairly simple way to look at it, I gather. But if you're going to walk away from something, either be totally prepared to walk away or walk away knowing that you have an ace in the hole. And I'm glad he's back. You're glad he's back. I'm sure the UFC is glad he's back, but they weren't going to bend for him. They are hard. You got to be Conor McGregor level to leverage them, man. It's other than if you're not Ronda or Conor or GSP or something like that, you're probably not going to leverage them. And so let that be a lesson to you. Do things that are to your benefit. Sign shorter deals. Try to get more upfront money or guaranteed money. Whatever that you can reasonably do to fix these problems, do it, because sitting out is not really going to work for you, unfortunately, and without some kind of collective bargaining basic protection, right? Brian Ortega. Do you know what's happening with him? I've not heard anything about Brian Ortega. Who is suffering more in Conor's absence? UFC and pay-per-view buys or MMA fighting and clicks? Probably UFC. We can get clicks. Remember that dude who was doing the break dance and they got kicked in the face? Like, that tore up the traffic for us. Like, it's good to have Conor and Ronda, but we can, we can get traffic from all kinds of crazy places. Like podcast. MMA purists. Hey, Luke. Hello. MMA purists like Joe Rogan, Robin Black, and many more have proposed changing the rules so fighters aren't inhibited by things such as a cage, rounds, or strike restrictions. Some suggest having them fight in an open field, no rounds, and having them fight to a finish. It's called Barge Fighting Championships. Hit up John Snowden about it. Do you agree with any of these ideas, and do you think they are plausible? Well, I agree with their basic premise of what they're suggesting, which is that these rounds that we have, these rules, this what is this scored, how is that scored, these are all largely either unhelpful or in their, I don't want to speak for them, but I think what they might say is these are essentially artificial ways of determining who the winner is. I mean, it's a logical conclusion you would draw. For example, people would argue in BJJ, hey, this point system is bunk. Let's do sub only. And I've argued if you're going to do sub only, that's fine, but you need to do sub only, no time limit. That works in BJJ, right? That totally works. That legitimately is a thing, but it's just not. It's not doable in MMA. The health consequences, I think, would probably be significant, and if they're not, the optics would be bad. Part of what makes prize fighting what it is that it is palatable. There is at least some safety or enough safety to enough people with enough expertise that it's allowed to go on. I don't think taking fighting to its ultimate conclusion about the only real way to decipher who's better is to eliminate impediments. I get that. I think that's fine. It's just not realistic because of the costs that could be associated with it. But if you're trying to find who the better fighter is, there's an argument to make that you should, take away the gloves, right? Take away time limits, take away referees, and just see who wins. Problem is, sort of very bad things might happen as a consequence, and the sport might go away forever. But I understand what they're saying. I don't think that part's crazy. Expectations for GSP's return. Hi, Luke. How do you think GSP will look after the time off? To what extent will age and ring rust play a part in his return? Do you think he will be able to be successful, in today's UFC, or does it all just depend on how they match him up? Probably the latter, but the first part I would say is, I'm expecting some level of degradation from what we were accustomed to, but at the same time, I think the one we saw against Johnny Hendricks or something like that against Nick Diaz was a guy who was probably not performing up to his best there either. So taking away the pressures of what caused his exit, giving him time off to just train and heal injuries, although he had another one with the ACL, but generally speaking, fight at he's not in these insane camps. I suspect he's been probably pretty good about preserving his body and keeping up with the martial arts, but ring rust is not a thing that affects everyone all the time, but it affects most fighters most of the time. I suspect it will affect him to some degree. So I'm expecting him to not look as good as he did before he left, but I don't know that I'm expecting a major drop off because of just who he is and how he trains and how he takes care of himself. I think he will remain competitive. And that's, look, even if he's 80% of what he used to be, that's still pretty good, right? Pretty good. All right, it is 2:15. Let us go to the Twitter machine if we can. You want to send me a tweet, you can do it at SBN Luke Thomas and use the hashtag chat rappers. It's all explained in the post below, and I will take a look at them. All right. How dare you say Derrick Lewis is not Shakespearean? I'm not saying it's not poetry in the end, but, it's not written in iambic pentameter. What are your thoughts on the UFC now waiting for much longer to announce headliners? I guess they're having problems getting guys to sign up as early as they used to. There is not nearly as much loyalty to the UFC brand as there once was, which explains both why guys like Horiguchi might, go to greener pastures in Japan, and why it might be hard to get guys to sign up for things when they're not feeling 100% or whatever the case may be. Based on Schaub's current success in comedy, if he rejoined the UFC, how big of a draw could he be? A headliner? Yeah. I don't know about the comedy stuff. I don't know how much. I don't know enough about that to speak about it intelligently, but he's got, fairly big following. I think he would be, he could headline shows, sure. I don't know about pay-per-views, but free stuff. Did Fedor save or even enhance Bellator's professionalism outlook by not accepting a last-minute replacement? That's a good question, actually. Yeah, I think a lot of folks would have been like, oh, they did the last fight and they put the okie doke on the viewers and Fedor himself, and that's a bad look. It's a frustrating look for him to not take a fight if you're a fan, but yeah, there might be something to be said for that. How do you see the fight between Gunnar Nelson and Alan Jouban going down? I think I see Gunnar trying to take him down, and I think Gunnar's probably going to be successful. Are there any prospects outside the UFC that are flying under the radar of fans and deserve more attention? I'm sure there are. Contact Smoogie on Twitter and Kaposa. They will be plenty of help for you guys. That's what they do. What do you think of a UFC university? Students could start training young and start a career in MMA. I don't think that's a good idea of a promoter starting a university to recruit talent. Let's see about this one. I can't really see it. Does Dana say anything more indicative that Dana hasn't fought than when he says, don't leave it to the judges? I don't think that's indicative of not fighting. I think that's just indicative of having a promoter's interest in saying that, which we went over last week. For Madrid's top three, would you prefer BBC, which is, of course, Bale, Benzema, and Cristiano, or Cristiano, Bale, and Morata? I will stay with the original. I think that Cristiano, Bale, and Morata is a great combination, but there's been a little too much Benzema hate that I don't buy into. I know how to swim, yes. Has the UFC gotten lazy or complacent with their presentation and marketing outside of Conor and Ronda? Don't know if I've seen enough of that yet. Certainly that 209 poster was a sham. But when you're there live, it doesn't feel very different. Feels very much the live show has not taken a hit. Weird question. Why does John Jones get all the flack for UFC 151, but Henderson is the one who hid an injury? Boy, isn't that a great question? True, false. Machida slept with one of the USADA guy's wife. How is he suspended for 2 years? Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know the answer to that. I don't know what to tell you about that. Ian Kidd's done a pretty great job over at Bloody Elbow discussing this. I've talked about it at length. I don't know what to tell you anymore. What's your take on Gavin Tucker's showboating, i.e., pointing at Cecilia's guy and shouting yes? Don't care. Don't care at all about. I have him on my show today too. Don't care at all about showboating. Doesn't bother me. I think that we have basically decided as a fan base to have our own versions of what kind of unprofessionalism we tolerate, and the only real contour it seems to follow is our own subjective sense of justice and right and wrong, which is to say there is none. So I don't care. 3 months along, how is your new Google Pixel XL working out? Best phone I've ever had. I had to get a second one because the first microphone failed, and then the only glitch in this one is if you open up like a product where you're trying to text, like an app, let's say WhatsApp, sometimes you have to like not close the app, but you have to get out of the keyboard and then back into the keyboard for it to work. That's not all the time, and it's rare, but it's the only hiccup. Oops. Let's see. Khabib's wrestling versus Tony's BJJ. How do you think this one plays out? I suspect Khabib's wrestling will win early. But by the way, Tony doesn't just have BJJ. Like, we think of that because he takes risks with it. You know, he'll flop to his back to secure a darce or something like that. But he's got great wrestling too. He comes from wrestling. That's his background, as a matter of fact. His background is not striking or jiu-jitsu. His background is wrestling. You saw that with his takedown defense against Rafael dos Anjos. And for me, I think it's a very big mistake to not take that into consideration. God, Valencia's still up 2-1. Kill me, bro. On the tweeters. What do you make of the UFC censoring Derrick Lewis's post-fight interview? I find it terribly unsurprising that a corporation would want to keep that kind of thing from being part of the public consumption to the extent that they can limit it. Has fake news influenced MMA media? It's influenced every form of media, varying degrees. I don't think it's a huge problem in MMA, but certainly it's part of it. Quick question regarding GSP's return. I'm a little surprised that no one is discussing the possibility of him potentially going for history by becoming a 3-weight world champion. I say no one, but perhaps some people are. I just haven't heard them. Certainly it hasn't been discussed widely. I'm not even sure GSP and his team are considering it, but if I was him, I would be. So this would involve fighting Bisping first and then dropping down to fight Conor at lightweight, or the other way, I suppose. Perhaps given the large weight jump between these fights, it would be impractical, which is why it's not being discussed or considered. Conor's break, however, may give GSP added time to transition between those fights. Certainly, it won't be easy, particularly the Bisping fight, in my opinion. But if he gets past Bisping and fights Conor, that is a very winnable fight for George, in theory. And that fight, with the added stakes involved, will be absolutely humongous. I think no one is talking about that because he's not even a two-weight world champion right now, much less a third one. And as you point out, jumping 2 weight classes down or up is significantly difficult. In fact, going up 1 weight class was primarily his main reason for not wanting to fight Anderson Silva low those many years. That it would take time to get his body to go up there, and that it would take time for his body to go back down. So, like, I don't think anyone thinks that Georges St-Pierre is a bad fighter unless you've won 2 titles first, which is no given considering you've torn both your ACLs and you've been out for almost 3 years, and you want to go fight outside of your natural weight class. I think jumping to 3 is, a bridge too far at this juncture, right? That's all I'm saying. No question for me this week, Luke. Just a suggestion. Would really love to see the chat extended to 2 hours. If you agree, please rec this to show Luke. Thanks, dudes. While I appreciate the support, I don't know if I'm interested in doing that. 90 minutes is plenty, I feel like. But I guess if there's a ton of support, we can go that direction. Interim belts. Luke, with all the recent upcoming interim belt fights, do we know if there are any financial rewards in winning one? Pay-per-view points, extra cash. Thanks. I believe if you get the interim title, yes, but I need to verify that, and I will. I'm going to 209, so I'll talk to some folks out there. It's a good question. I want to know for sure. How far do you think Derrick Lewis can go? Can he beat Stipe? Hard for me to see that. Kane, same thing. Verdum, if he can keep it on the feet, certainly. I think those top guys, it's going to be hard for him. The very, very top. But everybody else, it's fair play. When will the UFC take Conor's second belt? Look, the UFC waited a full year to take Conor's first belt at featherweight. Do you think they will wait this long with Conor's second belt at lightweight? With Khabib and Ferguson fighting for the interim belt in 2 weeks, it's possible the winner would be ready for a fight midsummer. How does this factor into their decision? Man, it's a great question. I haven't thought much about that. Well, he only won it in November, so I mean, it'd be really unfair to take another belt from him anytime soon. But God forbid if he gets catastrophically injured. If he takes that Mayweather fight and they don't set it up for 2018 and he's gone for 18 months, I could see that, I could see it at a point where if the interim champ, whoever it winds up being, Tony or Khabib, ends up defending it a couple of times, right? I think then they might say, okay, enough's enough. Or maybe they'll just be ruthless about it and they'll be like, you have another year, right? You didn't want to defend. You won it in November? Okay. Defend it by November or December or something. And we won't take it, but that's your timeline. It's hard to really say what the UFC is going to do here. I was surprised by the way they took it the first time. I think most of us were. Not surprised so much that they took it, just how they took it. I wouldn't be too rigid in my expectations about what could happen here either, because there's no guidelines either for the fighters or the UFC. It's just their whim and what Conor McGregor can reasonably do to them if they do it, or whatever the case may be. So, Cyborg USADA disclosure issue regarding today's post on Bloody Hell by Ian Kidd. It's also by Mark Ramundi on this one. Is it fair to continue with Cyborg claiming victim status when she clearly did not disclose what she was taking at the time of her sample being taken? Here's how it works with Cyborg, yeah? Y'all like my Dan Gable shirt? Pretty cool, right? Here's how it works. There is no amount of evidence at this point she can present to silence critics. It's not possible. Because for all the many years where she was not testing positive for anything, since that one incident in Strikeforce, not everyone, there have been lots of people who said, you know what? She's cheating the system. And then USADA came along, and they still came up. She's cheating the system. I don't know how she's cheating, but she's cheating. And here we have a situation where she is flagged for something. She is ultimately exonerated by USADA, the very group who the anti-dopers believe is the savior to the sport for reasons that remain unclear to me. But nevertheless, USADA's here. They will clean up the sport. Well, here they are, and they are exonerating her. And they are exonerating her with their own process that they put in place. And yes, it is relaxed in certain respects relative to what USADA does in other leagues, although in other leagues, their rules are more relaxed compared to ours, right? I mean, I think in track and field, they don't announce anything until after the investigation is done. So that would have saved her all of this completely. But be that as it may, for to retroactive therapeutic use exemptions, it's a little more relaxed in the Ultimate Fighting Championship. But the point being is, by the process that was available to her and every other fighter in the UFC, not merely her, this is not some special rule for her, she submitted for a retroactive therapeutic use exemption, and the process in place exonerated her. She completely used the avenues available to her as every other fighter in her position could have as well. And they have said it's okay, that the medicinal evidence here outweighs any concerns about doping. And it's still not enough. It's never going to be enough. Here's what we know for sure. She's negligent. No doubt about it. She's negligent. We also know that one time in the past, at least, she had used a performance-enhancing drug. Beyond that, we don't know anything. Beyond that, the only thing you can really say is what defines your own prejudices. Maybe you think she's totally guilty. Maybe you think this has been a witch hunt. Maybe you're somewhere in between. But it's never going to end. The point about this is it does not matter what evidence she shows the world. There will always be a sample of fans who find it unsatisfactory. New eye poke rule. Is it just me, or did the refs ramp up on starting to enforce the new eye poke rule this weekend? Not just this weekend, the one before. Since 2017. I feel like I've seen it a lot where referees are warning guys to reel it back in. Seemed like the refs gave fighters way more warnings than they did in the last couple of weeks. I'm following this new rule because I got into MMA because of Jędrzejczyk. I'm Polish, and she loves to keep those fingers out. By the next time her next fight happens, I'm worried the new eye poke rule may be overly enforced. She'll get nabbed a point or two and end up losing a decision. If she wins or loses, it probably won't be because of that. She does do this, but remember, you can do this, you can do that, or you can just sort of put the fist out. So you just can't be level with the hands. I think she's a top-level professional. She may win or she may lose. I don't think she'll lose a point or two because of that. She will make the necessary adjustments. Okay, thank you so much for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. You can email me at luke.thomas@sbnation.com with any questions. I'll try to put them in the chat next week or answer them time permitting. Please give it a thumbs up, share it around, and you guys are the best. Until next time, stay frosty.